Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. Planning ahead seems to have been the theme of the last month in China. Talks between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in South Korea at the end of October led to an agreement on a one-year delay to implementation of some of the more extreme measures in their trade conflict, including China's threat to restrict the export of rare earths needed for high-technology products, and US plans to expand its entity list, which bans trade with specific Chinese companies. The US also reduced the tariffs it had imposed on Chinese goods for what it says is Beijing's failure to prevent the export of chemicals used to produce the drug fentanyl, while China promised to start buying American soybeans again. And the two leaders agreed to visit each other's countries next year. But US tariffs on Chinese imports remain at around 47%, and there are plenty of ongoing issues to resolve, including a dispute over the export of US semiconductor chips to China. And the trade tensions seem to have informed the proposals for China's next five-year plan, which emerged from last month's plenary meeting of the Communist Party Central Committee. These emphasise the need for China to become technologically self-sufficient in the face of pressures from the US, and pledge to promote innovation and create a modern industrial system. But will this approach, along with promises to boost the private economy and improve China's welfare safety net, be enough to tackle underlying problems, including unemployment and slower than hoped for growth in domestic consumer spending? Well, to discuss these issues, we're joined today by Min-Sin Pei Min-Sin, Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College in California and editor of the website China Leadership Monitor, and author of many books on Chinese politics, including the recent The Sentinel State, Surveillance and the Survival of Dictatorship in China. Professor Pei, thank you very much for joining us. Now, Donald Trump described his meeting with Xi Jinping as amazing and gave it 12 marks out of 10. How significant do you think the agreements reached were, and where does this all leave the US-China relationship?
The most significant aspect of the meeting is that it averted a totally unnecessary disaster. Had they not agreed on one-year truce, it's really a one-year truce, then you would see very dramatic negative market reaction to a set of new tariffs, escalation, and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, common sense prevailed. Both the US and China believed that it was unnecessary because they were not going to achieve anything with escalation. If they have a temporary truce, then they might be able to resolve some problems. So this is, I think, the most significant aspect. I think if you look at it from the positive side, at least there is an element of common sense in this very, very tense, volatile relationship.
Obviously, a lot of it really was sparked by the imposition of tariffs from the US side. Do you see any indication that Donald Trump's approach to dealing with China will change in the next 12 months, as they've given themselves this time for this truce? And he, in theory, is meant to be going to China now in April next year.
We do not know whether human beings learn. There's a good question about whether human beings learn from their mistakes, from their success. But if you want to be very objective about the past 6 months, from Liberation Day, tariffs 7 months, to today, obviously Trump's tactics has worked with other countries. This is really about escalation dominance. But it has not worked with China. That's because China can counter-escalate. China has this trump card up its sleeve that's called rare earth minerals.
Rare earths, yeah, which they said that they were going to put all kinds of new controls on just recently, and the Americans appear to have reacted to that.
Yeah, well, because I think they're basically using America's export control playbook against the Americans. This is, I think, an aspect of China's tactics most people are not aware of. And China is simply copying the US tactics, and that's quite effective. But I think going forward, you can see whether the April meeting is successful. If the meeting takes place, because now you never know until Trump lands in Beijing. So that meeting, because it has to have some deliverables, I think that meeting is critical. If that meeting happens, then we can look at the full visit by Xi Jinping And probably that's going to take place before the midterm elections. So there are a lot of ifs and buts and so forth. But I think within the 12 months, I do not see any escalations, except because within the US, the sort of China hawks still would like to hit China with export control, with other measures. And if Trump is not paying attention, and if such measures are adopted, then China will retaliate.
You're suggesting that Congress might take a tougher line than Trump himself.
Congress, but I think more likely it's the Commerce Department, because this is now export control and other things. It's Commerce Department. So we're not completely out of the woods, even in the next 12 months. So both countries have bought 12 months, and it's much better than, say, 3 weeks ago, but we're still on very, very shaky ground.
You mentioned China's use of controls on the export of rare earths, and which is
Yeah.
so important to the world economy now. They also seem to have chosen quite an effective target in soybeans, and by shifting Chinese purchases from the US to Brazil, seems to have caused a lot of grief for American soya farmers, and now they've restored these. I mean, has Beijing learned quite a lot about how to tackle Trump and the
Yeah.
US in the last few years?
They've learned a lot because this is their second round. The first round, we're talking about 2018, 2019, China did not do very well. They were totally unprepared, and basically they signed a very humiliating agreement, a so-called phase one deal. But I think Chinese leaders said never again. So in the last 5 years, they've looked at what they could do. China does not have a lot of cards. The US still has a lot more cards than China has. But China has one trump card that is called the rare earth materials, as I said, because this is a card that can really paralyze the US manufacturing or the global economy. So they came very close to that, and both sides luckily stared down the abyss and said, no, it's totally unnecessary because it's not going to achieve what we want.
Presumably, one of the strongest cards that the US holds is the production of the highest technology semiconductor chips. And we've seen this whole debate about whether or not
Yeah.
this NVIDIA chip, the B30A, can be exported to China. We saw China putting its own controls on imports of US chips in retaliation earlier in the year. Do you think that that chip war will just go on despite this apparent truce?
Based on what I've been reading, I think the semiconductor story might be the story of yesterday, because China has made enormous progress in making relatively advanced chips, not as good as the US chips, but China believes that it can have good enough chips for its industry. So in Trump's first administration, he started tightening screws on China's chips sector. China was caught totally unprepared, as I said. But in the last 5 years, they've been investing a lot in the semiconductor sector. So they've made a lot more progress than people thought they would. So I think the gap will continuously close, but the US will maintain a very significant lead. The issue is, does China have good enough chips for its own use? Same with AI. So two very different approaches. I think what the US is threatening to do, which will have a short-term and devastating impact, is really software, because we're talking about a lot of enterprise software, data management, Oracle system is used in China, and talk about Windows, servers, a lot of these things. China does not have such software at the moment. So what we are seeing now is about a period of 5 to 7 years in which China still holds the rare earth trump card, but the US and US as its allies will gradually acquire their own production capacity. So over time, you will see the Chinese leverage decrease, and you can say the same thing about US leverage, because over time, China will have its own alternatives. So I think we are really looking at 5 to 7 years of persistent, irreversible, and accelerated technological decoupling. It's really about technology. Of course, you can talk about other trade and so forth. I think technology decoupling is a lot more important than trade.
There are still, in theory, these 47% of tariffs left on Chinese imports into the US, but you don't think that that's having such a significant effect as the Trump administration might have hoped, initially at least.
Well, it has a huge impact in terms of direct trade. US-China trade, you see, it's dropped 25%. But before Trump came in, China was subject to 27%. So that was bad, but still tolerable. An additional 20% is huge. But through third country transshipment, you can actually still sell something in a roundabout way. Of course, you make less money because you have to go through a lot of hoops. At the end of the day, I think the impact on the Chinese economy is real, significant, but not devastating. It's very different from, say, flipping off a switch and then China cannot use the software, right?
So you think they will still use the software as leverage in the coming years?
But I think decreasingly because China will, if you know anything about the Chinese government, once it's made up its mind, money is no consideration. And China has just millions of engineers. They're just going to say, okay, from now on, we're going to have our own operating system. We're going to delete America. They implemented that program a few years ago, but I think this time they're a lot more determined. So delete A as a Chinese strategy will accelerate it. And of course, you will have the sort of the US counter strategy, you might call it remove China from its supply chain. So that I think this is perfectly rational, strategic, and commonsensical.
Well, this whole issue appears to have informed the latest proposals for China's next 5-year plan, which will start from next year, with a lot of discussion of China becoming self-sufficient and able to protect itself and to build all the things that it needs, both technologically and in other respects. What do you think were the most important elements of the 5-year plan proposals that we've seen?
I want to say three things about the new 15th 5-year plan. The first thing I want to say is that in terms of its overall direction, the 15th 5-year plan is a continuation of the 14th 5-year plan, proposed about 5 years ago. The most important 5-year plan in recent memory is really the 14th in terms of strategic directional change, because it laid out two prongs of China's development strategy. One is technological self-sufficiency. The second one is called domestic circulation, dual circulation. And this plan does not differ that much from the previous plan. It underscores, it repeats many of the same things. So I think this underscores the leadership's determination that they're going to stick with a strategy of self-sufficiency, so China removing vulnerabilities or addressing vulnerabilities so that they will be much better positioned in the long term. So this is point number one. Point number two is that it's still striking that the 15th plan acknowledges one glaring weakness in the execution of a new development strategy. The proposal openly acknowledges that China's strategy of strengthening domestic circulation, that is, creating a much more efficient market at home, stimulating demand, increasing people's income, is not working. So I think this is a very important observation, because I think if you look at the sort of two prongs, China has made a lot of progress in the first prong, that is technological self-sufficiency. They're not there yet, but I think today they're much better positioned than they were 5 years ago. But if you look at domestic circulation, they're in deep trouble. You can see from all kinds of statistics.
So you're talking particularly about domestic consumption or
Domestic
overproduction?
consumption,
Yeah.
and also how do they unleash the potential of the Chinese market, also domestic economic reform. So I think that area they are acutely aware that this is the real problem for China. The third problem is that I think when you read the new proposal, they're prescribing the same medication. You could find practically the same policy proposals 5 years ago. They have not worked. The question is, why should you be more confident that they're going to be able to address these problems today?
So are you talking about things like reform of the welfare system and obviously
Yes, a fiscal
employment?
system, a lot of reforms, I have not seen them. So I think this is their real challenge.
They talked a lot about, for example, the new private economy promotion law, about guaranteeing the fair participation of private companies in the
Yes.
market, about competition, and about modernizing
Yeah.
the financial system. Do you not believe that this will be followed up with real change?
Well, I'm agnostic to a skeptical side, because we've seen these phrases, slogans before. So I think the Chinese private sector, the people who actually matter in terms of reviving the Chinese economy, these are investors, foreign investors, but most importantly, Chinese private sector entrepreneurs. We will see whether the government will follow up with real action. So if they privatize a big state-owned company, if they release wrongly accused, persecuted entrepreneurs like Ren Ziqiang, like Sun Dawu, that speaks volumes, right? The Chinese private entrepreneurs are very smart people. They're not going to believe in some empty words, however beautiful they are expressed.
Because I believe we've seen something like 40 bosses of listed companies have been
Yes,
detained this year already. So
yes,
that
yeah.
crackdown is not slowing down.
Yeah. No, no. So if I would to see whether genuine state-owned enterprise reform, which involves privatization, assuring deregulation, and strengthening the legal system. That is, if there's a legal case in which the government loses and the government actually accepts the loss and the judgment against the government is enforced, then I think the private sector people will be very, very confident.
And in terms of domestic consumption, I mean, what do you see as the key issues that could or should be tackled? I mean, the government has talked about improving the social safety net. I don't know how much the real estate sector was actually discussed in all of these documents, but that's
Yeah.
been generally seen as something that has really been a drag on the domestic economy because people are not confident about their incomes or the value of their properties.
Yeah, I think so. Domestic consumption, you have just two issues. One is cyclical, which has to do with the current downturn. That has a lot to do with the real estate bust, with I think some structural changes in the economy that you see a lot less demand for high-paying jobs. So the two can overlap. And then structural problem for China is that it's a highly unequal society. You have a huge segment of the population that earn basically subsistence level income. So this is one thing, that how do you improve the income distribution of the bottom 50% in China?
What would you suggest that they could do? What do you think they should be focusing on right now?
I think they need to improve the tax system, because China's tax system is not progressive. They collect a lot of taxes, but those taxes are quite regressive. The biggest contributor is the VAT, which is really a regressive tax. Income, they don't have wealth tax, they don't have property tax, they don't have capital gains tax. So they need to work. But right now, I think because the economy is in such deep trouble, increasing taxes might not be the best way of doing it. Another thing I think China can do, that's how privatization comes in. The Chinese state still owns a lot of assets. So why not selling some of the assets to generate income that can finance social services? Because I think if you can eliminate school fees, if you can increase access to the healthcare system, if you can provide more pensions, that makes a difference. And then over the long run, I think the state has to get out of the business of building stuff, because the Chinese state invests a lot in infrastructure, in local capital projects. State-owned enterprises is a net liability because they're not very profitable. So I think if the state can curtail its activities and redirect where its resources go, then we can have much more equal distribution, and the bottom 50% will have more consumption power.
Do you think that that's possible, given the emphasis in these proposals for the next 5 years on boosting China's technology sector? They do also talk about the real economy and not allowing the economy to drift away from the real towards the virtual, was one phrase
Yeah.
used by state media. But there is obviously this concern that sort of jobs for ordinary people will shrink as more money goes into high technology.
Yeah. Well, China's concern regarding its vulnerabilities to American sanctions is real and reasonable. But how much money you want to spend addressing these vulnerabilities? If you spend too much, you don't have the same resources to deal with the economy. So if you have a shrinking economy or stagnant economy and you want to devote more, if you want to transfer more resources into the science and technology sector, it might work for a short time, but over the long run, you will have less resources. So I think this is a very serious problem for the Chinese government. So I think if they are smart, and I think China has plenty of smart leaders, they really need to take another look and say, are we actually spending way too much money dealing with a very narrow problem? But you know the Chinese system, 30 plus provinces, every one of them wants to be a tech leader. It's not going to happen, right? So I think they need to be a lot more selective about which provinces, which companies to support.
I mean, they are talking about, trying to prevent further overcapacity as they develop the technology industry and AI and data centers. But I mean, overall, it does seem that a lot of the emphasis is on stability. And clearly, that may relate to how confident China's leaders feel at the moment. I mean, are they more concerned about how the young generation are responding to growing unemployment? And is that affecting their attitude to society at the moment? We've seen the continuing emphasis on cracking down on corruption, which Xi Jinping obviously believes is something the public will get behind. But what does all of this tell us about how strong and stable the leadership is?
Unfortunately, we don't know because the Chinese system has become even more opaque than it was before. But on the surface, you can say that Xi Jinping himself, as far as she is concerned, uh, he's not facing any imminent, direct, or significant threat. And I think coming back to the Xi-Trump meeting and how she has handled this round of the trade war, I think probably she has got more support. She has come out of this round stronger politically at home. But the party does face a lot of problem at home.
Because, there have been ongoing rumors, many of them relating to, for example, the continuing crackdown on top leaders of China's military. And we saw another 9 generals losing their
Yeah.
posts just recently. And the plenary session of the Central Committee was not quite as plenary as it could have been because there were more than 30 empty seats apparently
Yes.
shown prominently on Chinese TV news, all of the people who'd been taken away for investigation. But you're saying that overall Xi is strongly in control, and that this all shows how powerful he is.
Yeah, well, he's in control, but this does not mean he's not wounded. I think 30 empty seats hurt him a lot because these are the people who were promoted when he was in charge. So people would ask, where's the accountability? Did you actually know these people well? Especially the military, the top two generals who were his buddies. So I think on that issue, definitely he's damaged. But he's still in control because everything's relative. When you look at who else is out there in the Chinese leadership, they are not really sort of credible people to replace Xi. So that's one thing. But I think the party is very worried about persistent stagnation
Of the economy.
of the economy. Yeah, because over the Chinese society can probably deal with 3 years of slow growth. But this is year three. This is year three. But then if they just don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, then things could change. So I think the party is very worried about how persistent low growth, unemployment, pervasive pessimism could percolate up to the top.
We did see in the Chinese official media reports of the plenum of the party, which was making these proposals for the 5-year plan, quite a lot of very self-congratulatory comments about the stability of China's system. And they were
Yeah.
doing their best to obviously draw contrasts with some of the Western democracies. Presumably for China, this is beneficial because, for example, I think the People's Daily said some countries remain mired in short-term policy making and frequent policy reversals under multi-party systems, but China adheres to a unified national strategy, advancing steadily in the right direction. Presumably that kind of message does resonate with some people in China, probably with a significant number of people in China who obviously see the media reporting problems in democracies around the world at the
Yeah.
moment. Is that very beneficial to the current leadership?
Not necessarily. I think for the masses, propaganda is one thing, but after 5 years, their livelihoods have not improved. That would be a tougher sell for them. I think for Chinese, for the more well-educated, much more informed, this kind of propaganda does not really have much of an impact because we're talking about long-term, short-term. Chinese leaders are pretty good at short-term policy making as well. They keep patching up problems rather than solving problems. The real estate sector actually is a very, very telling example.
Real estate,
The
yes.
real estate sector,
Property market,
So
yeah.
because they've been just patching up, they've been using band-aid approaches.
Obviously, many people have speculated that if actually the economy in China is not doing well, one thing which Xi Jinping might focus more on is reunification with Taiwan. And we did see that this issue was mentioned in the meeting that followed the Trump-Xi summit between the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and China's Defense Minister Dong Jun. And Dong Jun said that the US must unequivocally oppose Taiwan independence and be cautious in its words and actions on this issue. Hegseth then told the Philippine Defense Secretary that they would work relentlessly to re-establish deterrence in the South China Sea, where obviously there's a lot of tension with China. I mean, at the moment, where do you think the US stands on the Taiwan issue, and how does Xi Jinping feel about Donald Trump's position on this, which of course could be key in any calculations that he is making?
Well, I think the US current stance on the Taiwan issue is confusing, to say the least. We have not seen Donald Trump making a public statement. The only thing is that, he did not think China would attack when he's in power.
We have
Uh,
seen Marco Rubio
yeah, but
reiterating
as you
US
know,
support for Taiwan.
whatever comes out of Washington, Donald Trump's words are the final words. And of course, he would be saying very different things at different times. So that would make it quite difficult. But I would say that on Taiwan issue, both what US says and does and what China does matter. So I just don't believe if this sort of what I call lazy thinking that, bad economy, China would sort of distract by attacking Taiwan. Logically, it doesn't make sense. If your economy bad, you're weak. How can you sustain a war? You don't have a lot of political support. The odds of success when you have a bad economy are low.
But we obviously have seen plenty of measures taken by China to increase pressure on Taiwan, shall we
Oh
say,
yes, that's
either
different
with
from
military
yeah,
exercises or
yeah.
psychological or
Yeah, of course,
other
but
other
that's very
ways.
different from preparing attack. China is obviously trying to have a full menu of options, including a direct military attack. But before its top leadership decides to pull the trigger, it wants to maintain high pressure on Taiwan. So that's why you see gray zone operations, psych operations, what have you.
You think there'll be many years of just sort of economic and other types of pressure on Taiwan from Beijing rather than significant steps towards a military confrontation?
If China wants to launch a fully prepared, decisive, and catastrophic war, China will do this. But this is so in the short term, I just don't see this because we're talking about almost World War III, and politically, militarily, economically, China is not prepared. But before that happened, accidents, deliberate provocations could trigger a crisis. And that is very likely. I would put that sort of Cuban Missile Crisis kind of confrontation at 95%. It's almost a foregone conclusion. So we will see a very serious confrontation
So
with the
you
potential of leading to war in the Taiwan Strait.
do you mean that there could be some individual clash between boats from both sides or
Yeah,
planes?
I think scenarios could vary. I think the worst thing that can happen is that nobody wants to escalate, but stuff happens and they stare down at the abyss and decide what to do. So I think we better prepare for that kind of confrontation than this sort of gory scenario of amphibious landing or a full blockade.
Well, Min Sin Pei, thank you so much for talking to us on China in Context.
Nice
Thank you.
talking to you, Duncan. Bye.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and our corporate membership scheme and read our latest blog articles on our website soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.